I have been open about some of the abuse that I have experienced in the church, and perhaps you have experienced abuse as well. The chances are that it played some role in your deconstruction of Christianity. I have invited Jay Medenwaldt to the show to explore this area further. Hello, doubters. Welcome to Dealing with Deconstruction. If you are asking big questions of your Christian faith, you are in the right place. Abuse is one of those things that no matter how we frame it, no matter where we look at it, it can be pretty disturbing. So I want to kind of just give you enough tools right here at the beginning to let you know that we could be talking about some things that may trigger you in a sense. And so I want you to know up front before we dive into this conversation with Jay, who has lots of education in the area of psychology, social psychology, and he is a Christian trained in apologetics and ethics. And so he has some great insight when it comes to abuse in the church. And I wanted to bring him on in order to be able to dialogue about this a little bit further. So Jay, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think one of the places that we need to start is how we define abuse. So one of the things that I've kind of noticed culturally is that sometimes the world, those outside of the church, maybe enemies of the church, if you will take any claims of abuse at all and say, yep, that's abuse. The church is terrible. Look, there's abuse there, and they will indict the church. And I think sometimes Christians tend to want to downplay abuse and say, no, that's not really abuse. That's just, someone being sinful or, someone, acting out of their trauma or whatnot. It's not really abuse. We kind of just ignore it. So help us start this conversation by just defining from a, kind of a clinical or an academic setting, what is abuse? What needs to be present for an actual abuse diagnosis to be given?
Yeah, so abuse isn't really a diagnosis, so that is kind of part of the difficulty. So if you look at the DSM, which is what clinicians will use for diagnosing disorders, it has very clear criteria. It'll be like you need to have this symptom and that symptom, or 3 out of 5 of these, things like that. Mm-hmm. We don't have something like that for abuse, but there is academic research on it where you do have psychologists and doctors and other people studying spiritual and religious abuse. And what you'll see in a lot of those articles is they'll go over what is spiritual abuse, and over again they'll say it's difficult to define. And so it is that's a combination of it being sometimes what we call concept creep, where it has kind of taken on a world of its own, but it's also kind of a challenging thing to consider, and a lot of it's somewhat opinion based. And so some things that might be considered spiritual abuse could be say a part of the clergy of sexually abusing someone in the church. Okay. That's spiritual abuse because that person is a spiritual leader. But if it was, say, another member of the church just sexually abusing another member of the church, often that wouldn't be considered spiritual abuse unless they were doing something like saying, well, the Bible or scriptures says that you need to do this or something like that. Then it becomes spiritual abuse again. So it gets kind of difficult and fuzzy. And it's also not limited to Christianity. We see that more in our culture because we're more Christian dominant, but it can apply to any spiritual or religious beliefs, and it's really common among cults.
Okay. So you kind of mentioned just the kind of maybe umbrella category of spiritual abuse. What are, if there are any, what are other kind of categories of abuse? Just kind of, maybe even outside the church, just, kind of in your research, what categories of abuse are they? And maybe, give an example, if you will.
Yeah. So there's, again, these categories are often used. They're not like clearly defined. Well, they can be, but it's not like here's what abuse is and here's these very clear different categories. They're kind of overlapping categories, and some people will use them differently or interchangeably. But you do have things. So you have emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and those are often used in the same way, but sometimes it can be different. You have physical abuse. There's sexual abuse. You may have things that under spiritual abuse where it may not fit under any of those and may be separate. But one thing you don't really see talked about, which is maybe a little frustrating, is neglect. And so I've actually been a foster parent in the past and have been involved in that system. And you see, so what do you have to report for? What do kids end up in foster care for? And it's abuse or neglect, right? And so, and we recognize, and there's a lot of literature, scientific literature on the effects of neglect and the effects of abuse on kids and their outcomes. And neglect is as bad or worse than abuse. But we don't see that in the conversation about spiritual abuse. We don't see spiritual abuse and neglect, which I think could be problematic, because spiritual neglect could be very bad and have very bad effects on person, at least spiritually, eternally, and we don't really necessarily talk about that. And I think that's because they're kind of on a continuum, right? If you're abusing someone, it's almost in a sense that you're over involved in their lives and in a negative way. And if you're neglecting someone, you're under involved in a sense where you're not doing the things you should be. And I think we probably see that a lot, but we don't really recognize it as being maltreatment, so to speak.
Right. Well, and I think, maybe help, paint a little bit of a picture. I think something like sexual abuse or physical abuse are far easier to define, or far easier even to recognize from somebody on the outside. So whether you are somebody that you're in a meeting, or that you're in a small group, or you're just kind of with people from the church, you can kind of pick out, like, okay, if somebody strikes somebody else consistently or just one time, that's abuse, right? That's very clear abuse. We have very clear guidelines about what sexual abuse are. And again, there may be some gray areas, but I think where it tends to get more fuzzy sometimes is on things like verbal abuse or emotional abuse, or just kind of general spiritual abuse. And you talked about neglect and stuff like that. So what might be an example of like emotional abuse, and what might be an example of something like verbal abuse, and what might be an example of something like spiritual abuse?
Yeah, so spiritual abuse, I guess maybe just to give that more of a clear definition for how it's often used, would be any sort of abuse that happens within a spiritual context.
Okay.
So this could be something as though it's from, say, a leader in the church abusing someone. So, it's I don't like the term spiritual abuse because I think we should just call things abuse.
Yeah.
Right, in general, but how it's used, the term spiritual abuse. So it would be someone, a leader in the church abuses someone, that's spiritual abuse. It could be, say, a spouse or a parent abusing their child, but using scriptures for justification of that in some way. Those are probably the most common of what you'll see, but I have come across people saying things as though, say, making fun of another person's religion or spiritual beliefs would count as spiritual abuse. So it's kind of normal name calling or bullying, but because it's put on them because of their religious or spiritual beliefs, that becomes spiritual abuse. And it's more just we should be aware of that's how sometimes it's used. And so spiritual abuse, broadly, any sort of abuse that occurs in any sort of spiritual or religious context. Now, examples of what you asked for, say, verbal or emotional abuse might be, say, name calling someone, berating them, telling them they're not good enough. But again, that's going to have that spiritual religious component. So coming from a leader in the church, or saying, the Bible says that you need to submit to me, or the Bible says that you're weak, or something like that. And so that's where sometimes you get into difficulties, and you get atheists will criticize Christianity for the doctrine that we're all sinners, because they'll say that's spiritual abuse. And in a sense, you say, okay, well, yeah, we're telling people like they're not good enough, or they're not living up to norms. And so it can seem that way in a sense, but when you understand more of what the term means, and what it means that we're all sinners, that we're not perfect, and that's something all people recognize, you say, okay, well, maybe that's not abuse. But then there are people who overdo it, right? They push that doctrine too hard, or they focus too much on it, or have a wrong view of it, and it can become that verbal or emotional abuse that they put on other people.
Yeah, again, like part of my story is like, oh, this is like a little bit of a counseling session with Tim here. So, again, part of my story is, being involved in church environment specifically, where there was a lot of pressure to be perfect, not necessarily in the sense of spiritually perfect, although that was a part of it, or morally perfect, but to kind of live up to the standards, these unrealistic standards of the job that I was being asked to do, given very short timelines with very little budget, but then asking, well, you need to do this big, huge giant task that we've, given you, or that we need to do this whole, service revamp in, 45 minutes or something like that on a Sunday morning. And those can be very difficult just to cope with and to deal with. And I know that, again, part of my story, I'll just share a little bit here and, just feed back to me on some of this here, Jay. There was a period of time when I was on depression medication while I worked at a church, because I would leave Saturday night service after being at rehearsal and Saturday night service and have just a terrible migraine, go home, vomit, and then pass out, essentially fall asleep, and then have to go back to church the next morning. And it wasn't until my wife was like, hey, something else might be going on here that we need to look at in a bit more depth, that I really understood kind of, oh, maybe there are other things going on that I need to deal with, in a sense. So how would you think about, and again, ask me some more questions if you need clarification with any of that. How would you address something like my situation? Because I think my situation could be similar to other people, where they're trying their best, but they're still kind of getting this pretty negative outlook from some of their church leaders. So how would you think about, or how would you address some of my story there?
Yeah, that's, I think, maybe in one of those gray areas where maybe it's abuse or spiritual abuse or not. And we see that a lot in the corporate world. We see it in academia. So it's one of those things that's not unique to religious belief. But I think from a religious perspective, I think we probably, I don't know if we see it more often or not, but I know from what I've seen, the reasons for it are sometimes deeper. So churches or pastors or ministry leaders will sometimes take the perspective of, well, you're doing work to the Lord, so you should be willing to do this and put in this extra hours and work extra time. We see that. I've heard about that, with missionaries. And sometimes it's not, the hard part is it's not always from another person. Sometimes people put that on themselves. And so it's like, can you spiritually abuse yourself, which doesn't really make sense. And I think it's, we should be aware of that. I don't know if people refer to that as spiritual abuse or not, but either way, it's wrong. And so sometimes, even with the best of intentions, we can't do everything, and we need to come to terms with our limitations, but it can have those major damaging effects, whether we put that on ourselves, that burden on ourselves, or it's being put on from someone else. And it's probably more difficult when it's put on, that burden is put on people from outside, from a leader or a congregation or denomination, because then you have that loss of autonomy, and that would certainly then fall under, I would say, what's considered spiritual abuse.
No, I think you raise an excellent point when particularly church leaders are highlighting the fact that, like, oh, you're working for the Lord. And again, there are biblical verses that say, that we should be bringing excellence, that we should be working for the Lord because he deserves it and because we love him. But again, I think sometimes those could be pushed too far, or at least have a perception of being pushed too far. So in that line, what other theological beliefs, if held, could likely lead to abuse, or that are easily abused, that also then lead to this sort of abuse that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not going to say it's a terrible question, but it's I only make that reference joking around because we know each other. But it's a tough question, because I think when you get any sort of hierarchy or rigid structure in any sort of organization, or you get some sort of doctrines or even moral codes that people are expected to follow, you're going to have potential issues with abuse. And we've seen that in corporate world. We've seen some of the things come out with, say, Google or Facebook and other companies where this is similarly an issue. And so I would say any sort of doctrine or belief within the church that creates hierarchy or power differentials between people, or also is very clear uh, kind of guidelines or rules that people are expected to follow that is potentially creating a situation for spiritual abuse. And
Mm.
so the problem is we don't want to say, well, we should do away with all of that. And I think that's where a lot of people run, especially in our culture recently. And we see a lot of, the spiritual but not religious and things where people are running from hierarchy and they're running from rules. Um, and I get it. Like I'm extremely um, very anti-cultural in a sense, and always have been. Like before I was religious, and even after, like I don't want things imposed on me, and so it's actually been something I've had to struggle with to be more willing to submit to other people and listen to them and do that. And so I get that draw and that desire to have that freedom and control of your own life,
Yeah.
but that should always be balanced with truth and with love,
Mm.
and recognizing that there may be this doctrine I see sometimes it thrown out there about complementarian. People will say complementarian, the doctrine of complementarianism. So the idea that men are supposed to be leaders in the church and at home. They'll say that leads to abuse. And again, I'm not sure on the research with that because I've seen some people say and cite research showing that it does, but I've also seen things showing that it's not quite that simple. It's a little more nuanced once you factor in things like strength of religious belief and things like that. And so we just need to be aware of that. Like any belief, it doesn't even have to be religious. It could be, our corporation here, we work these hours, or we have this doctrine of, we're open to everyone,
Yeah.
and we see that a lot in culture, and we're going to push that. It's going to be extreme. That can lead then to abuse, where people are bullied because they disagree or appear to disagree. And so it's difficult. And so we want to be careful not to run just because, or disregard doctrines simply because they have the potential to lead to spiritual abuse. But we do want to be observant and make sure we're protecting those who are weaker than us. So whether we're in a congregation and we're not leaders, we're just part of the congregation, we want to be, in relationship with other people and listening and friendships with them to make sure that they're not being abused by someone at that church, or maybe in their relationship with their spouse or someone else in some other way.
No, and I think that's right. I think one of the other possible beliefs that I think could lead to some sort of abuse, or even just kind of the beginnings of abuse, is when the pastor is not able to be questioned, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not even just like, again, we don't want to be constantly questioning or doubting the pastor or the pastor's leadership or his vision for the church, or kind of what in a sense God has given him. But I think there needs to be a kind of a healthy sense of I can go to the pastor with my questions and say, hey, this point that you raised in a sermon, have you looked at this research yet? Or that you can, if you're on a leadership team or whatnot, you can say, I'm not sure this is the best direction. And again, sometimes how that's approached, how the questioning is approached can be, part of that. And sometimes the pastor can react to like, hey, I'm trying to be in concert with the Lord. I'm trying to be in prayer with the Lord. I'm trying to move us in a certain direction that I think the Lord has us. And you guys are always pushing back. You're always negative. You're always being skeptical. But I think that that's not what I'm necessarily talking about when it's just when it's the, hey, I've said this is where we're going, and any dissemination, any doubt, any questions, any naysayers, you're out, you're ostracized, we don't like you, you're kind of get blacklisted. That's kind of more what I'm talking about. And again, I think that comes from some skewed passages in scripture, but I also think it can lead to abuse for those people on the team. How is that something that you would agree with? Do you think about that in that way?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, too, we need to keep in mind that most of the time abuse happens from someone in higher power to someone in lower power, but
Mm,
not always. There are men in marriages who are abused by their wives, even though the man is physically stronger. And it's not in every relationship that the man's physically stronger, but usually that's the norm. And sometimes the men are still abused, and for different reasons. It can be psychologically, they just feel like they're supposed to take it, or they don't feel confident standing up, or they're scared what's going to happen if they defend themselves. So um, we need to be aware of that and recognize that that can happen. And so it could be the case that a pastor is um, abusing members of the church, or putting things on them that they can't handle, or it's too much, or he reacts when they question him, and it could be that he is the one abusing them, but it could be the other way around, where maybe the board members or the congregation, they're constantly questioning and doing so much in a way is not just questioning, but questioning and doubting, but then threatening him, like, we're going to go to the board and have you fired or put on probation or things like that. That's where it becomes abuse. And again, that's normal abuse that we see in corporate world and other situations, but because it's in the context of a church, it's considered or often called spiritual abuse. And so we just need to be aware of that it does happen. And again, knowing that, we should be on the lookout for, not, again, even constantly on the lookout for this, but just willing to listen to people if they have or are voicing concerns or issues that they're struggling, whether the power is going up or down, and being open to that. And that's part of what we talked about before we started recording, is that sometimes in the church we're not willing to always listen to when people have been abused or take their word for it and trust them. And I think we need to do a better job of that in the church and being willing to have those conversations. But it's difficult because our pastors and leaders are people we trust. Often we've known for a long time, known a lot of context, and we think, well, they would never abuse or harm someone.
Right.
But sometimes they do.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really important. Again, I would probably say most of the people that are watching this are probably in the category of they're not necessarily in church leadership, although they might be. But let's just assume for a second that we're talking to somebody that maybe they've gone to counseling, maybe they've seen a psychologist, maybe they've identified some areas where abuse has happened, and now they're asking, what should I do? What should my next step be, particularly in the church? And so we know that the Southern Baptist Convention came out with a report not too long ago, looking at hundreds of cases of abuse, and some of them were ignored. They had documentation of some pastors being accused of abuse, but then kind of reassigning or not necessarily saying anything about that pastor or the abuse. And I was listening to a legal podcast, and one of the things that I thought was really insightful in this podcast was that they were saying, look, the lawyers are going to step in typically when these abuse allegations come to forefront, and the lawyers are looking at it from a legal and kind of an insurance standpoint, like what can you basically take from a monetary or legal standpoint. And the podcast host was basically saying the church needs to be more about the congregation as a shepherd. And I thought that was really insightful, and not necessarily solely take the advice of the lawyers, because the lawyers have a different goal and a different purpose. So there sometimes can be these competing values when you're dealing with abuse. So somebody comes forward in the congregation, raises a credible allegation of abuse, let's just say, and then it's like, what do you do? There's all then like ostracizing. So how would you talk to somebody about what to do next? What's the kind of next right step for someone that is a victim of abuse, particularly in the church?
Yeah, so that's part of the difficulty, because there's so many different levels of what is abuse. And so I would say, if it's something that is legally abuse, like very clear, like this is illegal, it's against the law what they're doing, I would say that you need to get the police involved. They are trained to handle this. They know what they're doing. They can spot fake allegations a lot better than the rest of us. They deal with this on a regular basis. It's like a plumber. If you call in a plumber, right? You don't know what to do. Like water's spraying everywhere. If you have an emergency, right? Like you're freaking out. You don't know how to handle it. That's an everyday thing for a plumber, and he or she knows how to handle it. It's a simple, easy thing, and they'll take care of it and do it right. And so, for regular people, our emergencies are everyday things for people trained in it, and they know how to do it. And so if they say it's sexual abuse in the church, or physical abuse, or abuse of a child or something, right? Call the police and let them take care of it, or child protective services. They're trained in that. They know what they're doing. They'll handle it. They don't just go in and remove everything and arrest people. Like, they know how to be discreet and do their jobs well. And so if it's a legal thing, I'd say get the legal authorities involved and let them handle it and sort itself out. Once you move away from that, where it is more of like things that aren't so clearly legal issues, one of the great things of living in a country where there are so many practicing Christians is you can get advice or outside help from, say, another church, another congregation, people from a different service. That way you can make sure there's not bias. You can involve other members of the church and have a conversation, schedule meetings with, say, the pastor or the board. Most churches often have an elder board or something you can go to and work it out. If you're not being heard or they're not listening to you, if you're the person who's experienced the abuse, or you're working as, say, an advocate with someone who's been abused, if they aren't listening or willing to work, then again, you can, if it is a legal issue, you can go to authorities. You can, if you're not sure if it's a legal issue, you can talk to a lawyer. Most lawyers, or a lot of them, will do a 30-minute or hour consultation to see if your case applies. So you can see if there could be something to go there, or even call the police and be like, hey, is this a legal thing? I know we have a desire and we want to protect the church and we want to do what's right in God's name, but protecting people who are doing bad is not protecting the church. Even if we have the best of intentions. So we need to be careful about that. But we also don't want to just, automatically run because we heard a rumor of something from someone who may not be trustworthy, because, especially now that my wife has been on staff at a church for the last few years, I've seen a lot of situations where people gossip and spread rumors within the church and say things that aren't true. So it can be hard, and we should be discerning. And I'm not a big fan of church hopping. I try very hard not to do that. But if there's abuse going on or something that is, even if it's not abuse, but it's maybe just very psychologically damaging to you or someone go to a different church then. There's no shame in that. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's, we talk a lot about, I think it was Andy Stanley, I was listening to something he was saying where he gave up certain things that he did when he had kids because he didn't have the time anymore. And so he was essentially saying, okay, I'm not quitting this forever, but I'm not doing it now. And it may be the case that there could be something at your church that is just really hard for you psychologically that you can't deal with. Maybe you broke up with someone in the church and it's a small congregation, you can't avoid them. Go to another church for a while. Maybe it's permanent change, maybe it's not. You can work in this. Most churches are pretty cooperative with other churches, and so let's say you have a good relationship with the pastor, but there's something else at the church that's giving you a problem. A lot of pastors, at least the ones I know, would still be willing to counsel you and work with you, even if you decided to attend another church. And they'd still be supportive and friendly towards you. And so I think sometimes we don't remember that pastors are humans and are trying to do the best thing. And so they're not going to probably feel threatened that you went to another church because you were having a psychological issue with an individual at the church, or maybe it's the location of the building. Like maybe just to give an extreme example, like say you were raped at that building, or in the parking lot there or something, like it would probably be pretty hard for you to go to that church. And so I don't know any pastor who would get mad for you going to a different church because you had that experience. But that's where the abuse comes in, where there's a handful, not people I know, who might say, well, that's something you need to just get over. You need to come to this church for X, Y, and reason or whatever. So ultimately, I say we don't have to have our minds set as far as like, this is my church, or this is abuse, or this isn't in this situation, and make up our minds and then stick with that all the time. We need to think and use discernment and seek counsel within and without our church, and even with therapists, Christian or non-Christian therapists, and see what their thoughts are, just to make sure we're getting an objective picture, and also prayer and seeking guidance from the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. You said one thing that I want to highlight there. Again, some of the stuff that you said was just amazing and great insight. But having an advocate, I think, is really important. And so if something that has happened to you that you think is abuse, that you're just kind of raising an eyebrow, right? have an advocate. Talk to a small group leader. Talk to somebody else in the church. Again, find maybe a Christian counselor and have a conversation with them, or a few conversations with them. There should be no shame and there should be no stigma around sitting down with a professional counselor. And often churches will have somebody on staff or someone that they can refer to you. Maybe you want to go outside that particular church if it is an allegation of abuse that's kind of under the roof of that church. You might want to try to find somebody else that's outside of that, but have an advocate and then try to sit down with them and have a conversation. Again, depending on the severity. We already talked about if this is a physical thing, if this is a legal thing, go to the police. There's another step there. But if this is in that gray area where you're not sure, again, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about was in that gray area, having somebody outside of my church that's a Christian brother in Christ, or if you're a female, sister in Christ, talk to them, have an advocate. One of the questions that you and I had that you answered, and I just want to highlight, is should you stay at an abusive church? And I would say you clearly said no, and I would want to echo that. No, find a different church. Again, try to go through the process of reconciliation, find an advocate, try to get a meeting with the party. And I can say this as well. I was serving at a church where I didn't necessarily feel like I was being abused by the ministry leader, but I thought it was close. This person would always put me down. They would always make comments. They'd always, kind of be sarcastic. And it was one of those situations where, again, I'm not saying that this person verbally abused me, but we ended up just going to a different church. It was fine. It was just saying, this is not the place for us. These are clear indications that I'm not getting along with this ministry leader, and that's an area that I like to serve in. It wasn't like I could just go to a different, area and serve someplace else. This person was kind of over a large area that I was serving underneath, and so I think that's totally fine. Again, this is kind of unpacking or opening up a big can of worms here. From your perspective, why do you think victims often get blamed while abusers stay in power? So again, this is a significant question. What is your insight on some of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's hard because we see that a lot in culture with rape as well. I think there's a lot going on. So one being, let's say I go to a church and I'm there for a couple of years, and then the pastor abuses me. That church, that pastor's been there for 10 years, 20 years, never had an allegation, never had an issue. People have been there, the board, they've been there, they know him personally, they've been to this person's house, they've had meals with him, they've seen him raise kids, right? So there's all that going on where they trust that pastor and that person, and they think, well, this person would never do that. I've never seen a sign where he would do something like that. And so it's hard because those situations do happen where someone has a clean record and great relationships, but they've still abused people. And so it's hard to believe someone you don't know very well compared to someone you know really well, and you know them to be a stellar person and seemingly above reproach. And so that's hard to kind of get over and to believe someone when they say that. And so in most cases, the person making the allegations is not lying. And again, our job isn't, as a board member or congregant, isn't to make that determination, right? We need to let the proper people handle that and try and figure that out. But the other thing I think we look at, so as a psychologist, everything we study and we look at, we're looking at multiple causes, right? So we don't just say X causes Y. It's more of X, Y, Z, P, D, Q all played a role in causing Z, right? So we're looking at a lot of these factors, and we do that with everything, and it helps us understand the world better. And I think normal people do that in their normal intuitive reactions to things. And so when we see or hear something bad happen, like we immediately, I think, recognize, like, okay, both people are probably at fault, but for whatever reason in the situation, or maybe our own kind of predilections, we may be more likely to blame the victim, or even say, we'll recognize, okay, the pastor in this case, the abuser, I guess we just say the abuser did wrong, and so that person is going to get taken care of. The law is going to sort that out. They're going to be punished, and they should be. But now I want to, or maybe not want to, but maybe then we also have this, we're going to ignore that because we know it's handled, and then talk about or comment on the role of the person who was abused and say, well, they should have done this or they should have done that, or should have been more wise about that, because I think doing so helps us feel a little more in control of our lives and feel like the little more of a just world. So we actually call it the just world hypothesis, where this idea that people have kind of this view or predisposition to believe that the world is just and things work out the way that they're supposed to. And so, and we also know psychologically that people like to feel like they're in control and like to have certainty. So I think sometimes when we say, well, that person shouldn't have been staying there late at night with the person at the church or whatever, they should have known better and avoided that. It's like, yeah, well, sometimes what we should do and what we do, like we can't predict everything. We can't be free of risk, and we also can't discount how often things happen step by step. So it's usually not the case where someone just meets someone and the person's automatically like, oh, I'm going to abuse you. It's usually a very slow, progressive process, and we see this with affairs and abuse outside the church. As it starts with something simple as making sexual innuendos or something, and seeing how they respond to that, and then it's cat calls or it's inappropriate touching, and it doesn't seem like it's a big deal, and then it gets to a point where it's like, okay, well, that seemed inappropriate, but this thing that he did last week, that I didn't say anything then, so now I shouldn't say anything now, and so people blame themselves, and then it continues, and then it can be very hard. And so I think we need to be aware of that and aware of how those things happen, so we don't blame the victim, even if the victim could have done something different, right? That's irrelevant. They didn't. A lot of people who are going to blame the victim also probably won't have done something different either. So there's no point in blaming them, and it doesn't matter if they could have done something different or should have. That's irrelevant, and that's something that you can fix and take care of in your own life, but it's not your role to fix and correct in someone else's. So be there, be supportive of them, help them, because it is difficult, and they are probably experiencing way more self-blame and guilt than people imagine if they aren't the victim themselves. And so it's better that we be there to support and counsel them. And if they ask, or in the future that opportunity comes up, then we can say, okay, yeah, here's something maybe you can do that's a little more wise to avoid this in the future, but no need to be blaming people.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Jay, thank you so much for sharing your insight on this subject. Thank you so much for your wisdom here. Hopefully the audience was helped with some of what you said. Any final closing thoughts or words that you want to share with us?
No, I mean, I think we covered it all. It's maybe just to keep in mind that abuse is abuse. It's all bad abuse, and it happens in any context. And so just because there is one person who's abusive in a church doesn't mean that whole church is corrupt, or that whole denomination or whole religious belief is corrupt. And this goes within the Christian context or within others, and it's same with the corporate world. And just because I hear a news report that some company allowed abuse, or one person was abusing someone within that company, even if they're higher up, that doesn't mean that the whole company is bad. And there are often good people who and I say maybe weren't victims in a situation where a spiritual abuse happened, but who really truly didn't know. And then there are some who did. And so I think just in general, be careful of painting things with a broad brush, and be careful and with how you do that, and take things case by case, and be an advocate for those who need help. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do anything monumental, but be there and listen. And that goes a long way. And a lot of what counselors do, and that's not my area of psychology, but I know enough to know a lot of what they do is to listen, and not just sit there, but like ask questions and take an interest, and really allow people to feel heard. And that's something all of us can do. Regardless of whether we believe what someone or agree with them, we can still listen and be empathetic.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for checking out this episode of Dealing with Deconstruction. If abuse has played a role in your questioning your Christian faith, I want to say that you are not alone. I too had kind of my deconstruction process where it began was questioning whether or not the church leaders that were, in a sense abusing me really loved me, and that played into asking whether or not Jesus really loved me, and that started me on my questioning journey. And so I want to say that you're not alone. If you are in this place, feel free to join our Facebook group. The link for that is in the description. It's a great place for conversation. If you want to email me, I'll go ahead and put my email on the screen. You can go ahead and email me. Again, I'm not a trained psychologist or psychiatrist or a counselor or anything like that, but if you just want to email me and share a little bit of your story, I would love to hear it. And if I can point you in the right direction, I will do my best to do that as someone that has lived and experienced something similar. So with that, I want to say we'll see you next time as we deal with deconstruction.